In this recording, I want to discuss what I mean by a message story, the different kinds of message algebras that are available, what I call socialization of a being, and I also want to extend the diagram I did earlier of system consciousness, and I want to widen it out to include the concept of positioning the virtual self inside different rooms in the brain. So, for example, the concept of sleeping versus being awake and imagining and so on. So I'll get started. So first, um, the first idea that is kind of an important one moving forward is the idea of a message story. So if we have ideas in these message algebra, we can gather them together into what I call message stories. So this might be kind of a typical example might be how you learn how to fix a wheel on a car, for example, and it's what we would call a series of instructions. So you can map a series of instructions into a message story containing different aspects of message algebra. Some would be visual clues. You know, you would maybe see diagrams, or maybe you'd watch a video, or maybe you would be taught it through a book or through some kind of a website or whatever, or maybe someone would show you, and you basically would store that in your mind in the message story relating to the task at hand. So that's the idea. So the idea is groups of messages stored in message stories, which are groups of information related to a particular task or piece of information. Um, then there's the idea of acquisition of language. I dealt with this in the previous video. So the idea here, of course, is, as I've said already, is that we have a built-in language algebra which is native to our bodies. So we may not have learned how to speak, but we can think and we can figure things out and we can solve things, even if no one has ever taught us how to. Uh, no one has ever taught us how to actually speak in a particular language. We know how to solve problems without having to be taught language in order to do it. So the idea is, in our bodies there's an underlying language algebra which is independent of all nations and places, but it's built into our DNA. It's part of our HOS. It's in our HOSL, HOSL. So basically, we can gather food, we can survive, we can figure out how to make decisions. Now, of course, as education will structure those ideas. So learning is seen as a mapping mechanism from the HOSL to the locale. I talk here kind of at a high level about socialization of a growing being, and this is an important idea, which is basically when Alan Turing thought deeply about sort of, in the early stages of computer science, when he kind of theorized what a computer program could do and how it could work. He came up with the concept of like an android girl and a kid who would be brought up in with a normal family and would learn what it was to be human by living with the family. And in modern times, when behavioral psychologists have studied human behavior, they found that socialization of a being is very important, in that the interaction between a mother and a child and all that, and emotional and physical growth. And they've actually shown that if a child doesn't receive a certain degree of stimulation, then it can seriously affect their growth. So the idea would be physically and emotionally and intellectually. And the reason, according to this idea, is that the interaction actually kind of fires messaging within the body of the child, and the child actually goes through a series of changes as a result of interaction, where it's trying to learn the locale and trying to understand the social rules and so on. So it's pretty important that the socialization of a being is done. And if one thinks of androids and one wants them to become good citizens in human society, it probably makes sense that some aspect of this idea is put into their creation. I don't have specifics right now, but the basic idea is, you might want, the androids to be carers for people who are maybe in having trouble with things, and you need them to be caring. So basically, this is the idea. Uh, so that's the idea of the socialization. Um, then there's the improving language translation. This goes back to the idea of the fact that the genome has a hosel and an underlying language communication mechanism, and basically one of the big problems that computer science people have is, even today, but I'm sure it will improve in time, it will be improved, is a lot of the statements we use in spoken language, in written language, it's quite hard to translate them using using information based on the actual wording. For example, give me a hand, and then if you're in German, it's geben Sie mir eine Hand, and so if you take then that if you take that piece of text and then put it into a Punjabi engine, you get a piece of text that looks the following, and then you put it back into English again. So the idea is you keep moving it from one translation language back to another, and then eventually you get back, you give me a hand, and the ordering of the words and so on. So what you get is kind of that the semantic context of the information is lost. So the idea is pretty simple. Is that what you do is I have another example from Babelfish, but the basic idea is that the source language is translated into a language message algebra at its core, and then it's then translated into the target language. So it's basically an interlingua. So we think of the language message algebra as an interlingua, which can be mapped. You map your statement into this interlingua, this Hazel message algebra, and then you can map it back out to any language. So you try not to keep turning it directly into another language and then from a language to a language, because there's so many kind of implicit assumptions that people in the cultures and the societies know, that they know just from when they grew up in the society, what the sort of the other meaning of the words are in the context. We call it context, but really context would be the language message algebra. So that's the idea. So if we can define a language algebra in the Android language, then it should be moderately simple, not easy, but simpler than it might be. It might mean that an Android could become a pretty good translator if one adopts this approach. But you'd need to have people who would translate all the different statements into this language algebra, which is part of the Hazel, which I assert in this theory exists in a human being. That's the theory. So basically, I talk about reading a text and answering a question on it, and then we need to talk about having an algebra for kind of looking up questions and so on. I talk about that later on, about set theory and how that could be achieved. And then I talk about the physics of the brain, or the biology of the brain is probably the correct way to put it. There's gamma and there's glutamate, and there's controlling signal transmission. And basically, we all know if we have a few drinks, and I aim this comment specifically at myself, if you have a few drinks, you tend not to be as coherent as you would be if you didn't have a few drinks. And this all goes back to these message pathways, which are affected by alcohol and other kinds of drinks, stimulants or depressants or whatever. So that's the idea. So if one thinks of alcohol, one would think of it as stopping message flows in the brain on a particular topic, and one might become very repetitive. I talk as well about facial expressions and emotional algebra. So in the world, the human world, a lot of values placed on facial expressions. So you may say nothing, you may have non-verbal gestures, as they say, but to a human being, there's people who even specialize in studying what these faces mean and translating them. So the idea is pretty simple: is that that the facial expressions end up being turned into some kind of emotional algebra. So the idea is everything that a human being does gets turned into this algebra, and in this case, maybe an emotional algebra. Maybe you look sad or you look happy. So those facial expressions can be mapped to emotional algebra statement: happy, sad, and so on. So we're trying to kind of cover all the different things about a person beyond just the specifics of how cells talk to each other, to the actual facial expressions and all this kind of stuff. Then we're talking about dreaming in another language. So, sometimes people say, when they learn a language, they really cracked the language. Why? Because they dream in the language. And they say, oh, I had my first dream last night in this new language I've learned. So the idea here is that the body has this underlying hustle, and then if you have enough pathways to this new language, you dream in that language. I don't want to say anything more on that at the moment. Now, this is where kind of we're going to really start to kind of crack open the architecture a little bit more. It's what I call context switched rooms, and the idea here is that we have a reality room where we live, and our bodies build this room that we live in, the self, as I call it. And then this isn't the only room one can live in. There's different rooms. For example, when one sleeps, one is in a kind of a dream room, and then when one is maybe trying to figure something out, one is context switched into another place, maybe a room where one has creative thoughts and kind of imagines things. So the idea with this theory is that there's message types, but there's also kind of a room. There's a room kind of API or a capacity for the brain to create and switch the self into different rooms, and the system consciousness does this. A good example, of course, is when one gets tired and one says, I need to get to sleep, and then the person will close their eyes, and then suddenly you dream and you're in this other room in your mind. So the idea is that the brain offers this facility to us where we can switch into these other rooms, and it doesn't have to be dreaming. It could be a creative room, or it could be maybe you're working on something, or it could be a project, or whatever you want to work on. So basically, it's context. I call it context switching. So that's how one gathers. That's how one gathers one's thoughts. So I kind of try to capture that in this diagram here. So this is the original diagram where we have the system consciousness, where all the messages come in, and then you're asleep. And in this case, the diagram, you're asleep, so you're not awake, obviously. Pretty clear that. And you go into a room which is when you're awake, which is the awake thinking room, and when you're awake. And of course, I have a little X here which says there's no connection between the self. So the idea is that the self, which is the person, the virtual person that lives inside the brain, has no connection to the awake room because you're asleep. So you context switch into the dreaming room, which is created by the brain, and then there's subconscious messaging that goes into the dream room, and you find yourself in this room in your dreams, and basically you can imagine, you kind of you've no real great control over what you're maybe seeing, and there's a variety of Freudian books written on all this stuff, and basically you might be awake and you might be trying to figure out how to design something. So you might imagine it, and then you write it down on a piece of paper. So, and then when you're awake, you can see what's around you, and there's a lot of messaging. And then we go into the sci-fi realm here. I have a story called Engines Under Ursa. So the idea here would be you could place the virtual self in a kind of cyberspace room. But that's more kind of speculative. But basically, we have our dreaming room, we have our awake room, we have our imagining room, and then you have people who maybe are chess masters, and they can create. The idea was they can create all these other rooms, and they can play games of chess in their mind, and then they'll be able to switch in and out of them. So this like switching around into these different rooms, and it's a genetic thing. Some people have a better ability than others, but the core ability to be in this thinking awake room reality room, as I call it, is available. So that's the idea. So you've all met the messaging coming in, and then into this room, thinking room, and then your virtual self connects with that room, and then you're kind of a conscious, as you would say. So that's the core design. That's the core design. Messages being fed into various rooms where the virtual self is positioned, switching in and out, and so that's the idea of the architecture so far, and this is what one aims for with the Android.